Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here at my next Last Jedi discussion topic. This one is going to be my discussion on Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi. So, getting straight into this, I think it's very fair to say now that the movie's been out a few weeks. We've had a chance to really see what the kind of general reaction is to the movie. I think, as much as there's problems I think that people seem to have in a lot of places, the main core of it, I think, does come down to Luke. That this is seen as the big controversial decision that the movie made was, one, the decision on how to portray Luke in the movie, and then I think also the direction they took with him, given that you've decided to do it this way. And I'll just straight away say that, like I said in my review of the movie, I don't mind. I actually like a lot of the scenes with Luke, and just that it adds extra layers to the character. A character who, just with 4, 5, and 6, is a fairly simple character, and I feel that after so much time has passed, you needed to give him a few extra layers, something to explore and deal with. But I do also understand at the same time why people, especially original trilogy fans who grew up going to see the original trilogy, why you would be upset at Luke being portrayed this way in the movie. I think it's one of those things where, like, yes, I understand it, but that you should be able to accept it because so much time has passed. Not to, I suppose, diminish that that's an issue that some people have, in that I feel there are other parts of this movie to criticize with regards to Luke, which I'll get into. It's just that I have seen a lot of articles and stuff like that go up about the idea of, expectations, fan expectations, fanboys from like certain different like generations of the fandom are wrong because they feel a certain way compared to someone else. In those cases, I feel like, look, there's some validity to that, but at the same time, they're allowed to feel that way if they want. If this isn't the Luke that they wanted, that's a perfectly valid criticism as well. But as I said, I don't mind Luke in the movie. The problem I think I have with Luke, and it's really difficult to explain. There's just a lot of little things that lead to me just kind of being like, if the expanded universe doesn't actually like cover the other stuff with Luke, basically the gap between 6 and now, I'll be pretty annoyed if that doesn't happen. Because as much as I feel that this is a solid kind of end to Luke Skywalker, I suppose not including Force Ghost stuff that will probably happen in Episode 9, I think when you view the movie and just really take the scenes with Luke out and just look at it as just an entire arc across the movie, not really looking at the other plot points that are happening here, it has so much potential. This is a plot point that has so much potential of just Rey going there with so much hope, hoping that Luke will immediately jump in and train her and rejoin the Resistance, and that will be the return of the New Hope in a way. And the idea that when she arrives there and he just tosses the lightsaber away, wants nothing to do with her, the reveal later on that he's cut himself off from the Force and has really just removed himself from everything and just wants to die, just wants the Jedi Order to die. That is a really good premise to set up. I ultimately feel that the movie doesn't devote enough time to the switch around for Luke. I like the scene when he finally does switch around, and it's the big one in front of Kylo at the end. The speech that he gives just before he basically ends the Force projection of himself on Crate. That, the rebellion is reborn today. The war is just beginning, and I will not be the Last Jedi. I like that scene. I don't think it was amazing how they got to that scene, because I felt like there's a certain point where, like, Luke is just like, he is not having nothing to do with Rey, and it really takes up until him, I suppose, reconnecting with the Force himself for him to really be in any way open to kind of what's going on here. Because I think one of the biggest things with the marketing of this movie, and I suppose expectations, is that I think we went in expecting Luke to actually train Rey at least a little bit. And when you really come out of the movie, the only training that she actually is given by Luke is the what actually is the Force scene, which is great. It's a really, really good scene, and I think it does help her. It's just he gives her no combat training. He gives her no like direct training about how to specifically use the Force to do certain things, or any just training related to being a Jedi. He basically just gives her like his set ideas for why he thinks the Jedi should end, rather than really necessarily teaching her all that much. And I think it ends up being this weird situation where I don't think they have enough scenes with Luke covering his switch from being "I want nothing to do with you" to "I'm going out to crate." The scene with Yoda, I think, is one of the best Luke scenes in the movie. I'd actually go as far to say almost that I actually considered the scene between Luke and R2 to probably be one of the best Luke scenes in the movie, because as much as like it's not super important, it felt like in a way there was the scene in the movie with Episode 6 Luke. That's the return of him, older, still addressing the fact that his character's at this point, but just happy to see R2, referencing all this other stuff from the past, and not him being so kind of, I suppose, cranky. But the scene with Yoda is obviously the big turning point. And I definitely have a slight issue with regards to the timing of these scenes, in that it's at this point in the movie where you get a lot of Rey and Luke. You get a lot of the scenes of Rey's connection with Kylo, her going into the darkness under the island of Octo, talking to Kylo again, and at that point, Luke comes in, stops their connection, the Luke-Rey fight happens, Rey leaves, and then Luke immediately goes to burn the books and the tree of the first Jedi, the early Jedi Order. All that stuff is like this really packed section of the movie. I think the problem is that after that, we just kind of stop with Luke until he actually arrives on Octo. I think there needed to be a scene between the Yoda scene and him actually turning up on Crate, and I also think there needed to be a scene between Rey leaving and him actually deciding to go burn the books, because it is very sudden how Rey leaves and he's suddenly like, it's over, I'm going to burn the books, and then the Yoda scene happens. I think that there needed to be more there, and I think it was the lack of something connecting those two scenes that really, I think, showed me with the movie, especially watching it for a third time last night, that you needed some of these connector scenes to get the arc across a little better. Because it still feels like we're dealing with kind of, grumpy, doesn't want to train anyone Luke, because he's not training her. He's a little bit more open to her, but it's all with the intent of trying to convince her against the idea of what it is to be a Jedi. And while I think ultimately maybe he would have got to a point where he did train her, she wasn't getting enough out of the training with him, and that's ultimately what led her to kind of open that connection with Kylo more over the course of the movie. And I suppose this is where we'll get into the whole flashback thing that they show 3 times from kind of 3 different perspectives. Luke being very cagey about what happened, Kylo's version of what happened, and then Luke's actual version of what actually happened. I overall like the scenes. I really appreciate Star Wars, I think for one of the first times in the actual movies, just full on doing a flashback. I think that works really well. I think the problem is that they only focus on what is effectively like 5 seconds of like flashback, and they just cover that same 5 seconds like a few times. It's interesting, but I think it's all let down a little bit by the fact that it is so vague still why Ben has any darkness within him. And I think this is something where maybe Episode 9 will cover, but I also don't know if it will cover. And I think it is actually important for us to be told this, because the whole reason that Luke goes to, at least for a second, try and kill Kylo is because he senses within him this darkness, and he basically senses the future, that like he's going to do something bad in the future. And he says something along the lines of like, Snoke had already poisoned his heart with darkness. How? Like, where did that happen? Who let Snoke talk to Ben? When did this happen? because Snoke, obviously, we know nothing about him. He mentions, like, when I found you. So was there a moment where Ben was, like, missing and Snoke found him, and then he joined the Jedi Order? Or what? And then, like, we sort of have this idea about, like, he has issues with his parents because of whatever went on, but they're not really exploring that all that much. So it's this idea, like, Luke's failure is Kylo. The transformation from Ben Solo into Kylo Ren, that is his failure. In the same way that, like, in a way, one of Yoda's failures was that one of his students, Count Dooku, turned to the dark side, Obi-Wan with Anakin, and just the Jedi, I suppose, in general, with what happened in the prequels. But you're making Luke's big failure to be this. When they put everything on 1 second of him thinking that he needs to kill Ben. And they say it, that, he faced the consequences of it immediately when he saw that Ben was looking at him. It's just that I still don't know the full context behind why Ben is kind of dark in the first place. And why it even got to that point. And I think it does take a little bit away from the scenes as it happens in the movie, because it's just this general thing of, like, there's darkness within him. Whereas at least with Anakin, like, who has a somewhat similar arc to Kylo, you saw what was happening with him. The Jedi, in a way, predicted it, that because they started training him at such an older age, he has all these connections to his life and these things that could draw him to the darkness. In the same way that they sort of hint at that with Rey, that her weakness is her parents, and if used correctly, you could use her parents to exploit her, to bring her to the dark side. And that's very similar to what happens with Anakin, with his mother Shmi, and then of course with Padme as well. That it's this clear weakness with Anakin, that he is so attached to the people he cares about that he would turn to the dark side to save them, and that's how it happens. And you see these clear moments of darkness over the course of his story, that you understand when he eventually makes the turn why he does it. With Kylo, it's so vague, and they're, like, talking around it, and just, like, he's clouded with darkness and he's conflicted. And I don't think they really simply explain it with just Skywalker blood is tainted, because I think they very clearly say that Snoke poisoned his heart, he tainted him, basically. But how? What did Snoke do? When did this happen? And, like, Luke, I suppose, he says, like, Leia says it was Snoke, but it was me. And it's just like, but it was Snoke. Like, if Ben wasn't affected by whatever Snoke did to him, I don't think Ben would have immediately killed everyone in the Jedi Order, apart from the few people he took, which I assume become the Knights of Ren. So, that's where I think some of this stuff with Luke falls a little flat in the movie, of just, that is your centerpiece of why Luke is the way he is that flashback. And while it's good, and while I really do like the way Mark Hamill acts when he finally reveals the truth to Rey, it's a really emotional scene between the two of them. You have the fight, and you eventually have him reveal the truth to her, that, for a second, just for a split second, the moment passed and I felt shame, and then the consequences, and we see what happens. And that's why he considers himself a failure. That's why he doesn't want to train any more Jedi going forward. And that's fine. It's just the core point of why this all happens with Snoke and his relationship with Ben Solo while all this is happening. I don't get what's going on there, and I think that's an important thing to say. And I don't know if 9, whatever way they go about approaching 9, if that is the story that will ever come up. And that's where I think you either need to do something now between movies with the books and tell those stories, or do it in 9. I don't know what other option you necessarily have. And it's similarly with Luke. The idea that you've skipped over all this really interesting time with him, of, like, he's just become a Jedi Master, the world is at peace. What's the stuff that he does immediately after this? Like, how does he go about forming the Jedi Order? Like, are we going to get a novel about that? Because I think the frustration that I think a lot of people have had with the EU as it's been with this new era, the new canon stuff, is just that it's felt like they've done everything possible to avoid any of the books telling any sort of a story that's like interesting, that's notable. And it's not because like, oh, we'll tell that in the movie. It's just because, no, I don't think you are going to tell that in the movie, but for some reason you don't seem to be moving towards telling that sort of a story. Like, why can't we? In that, like, I remember back when the prequels were airing, like the original Clone Wars cartoon like came out before Revenge of the Sith, and it gave context of why we were jumping in the way we were, and that was just a really cool thing that they did. I think almost all of the books had like a prequel novel to kind of like lead into them, or something like that, and they worked out really well. The same I don't think can be said necessarily for these movies, because everything seems like, oh, here's a book about stuff on Canto Bight, and here's a comic where you'll learn this really minor piece of information about this character here. So, I don't mind if we have to rely on the EU for some stuff. It's just, can we even at all expect the EU to cover any of this stuff that we wanted them to? But anyway, we'll get back to Luke here. And the Yoda scene, I think, is the important one to talk about after this, because this is exactly what happens. Rey goes off, he tells her, this isn't going to go the way you expect it to, because I suppose he knows this from kind of experience in a way, and everything that's happened, that just this simple idea of you saw his future and it was stable, that's not the way it's going to work out in reality. I know it because from experience, and that's the expectations he had. But I do like the moment where Rey kind of says that, like, okay, you take the lightsaber, you become the person that I want you to again. If not, I'm taking it and I'm going to do what I have to do. I like that she gives him that choice and he still decides against it. And then everything is really on the Yoda scene to kind of get Luke to the point where he needs to be. And it's a really, really, really good scene. I think it is excellent. I just think they almost rely on this one scene too much with his entire arc. In that I like the core of like learning from your failures, and Yoda pointing out to Luke that yes, your failure was that we lost Ben Solo, but you're too busy looking out in the horizon and the darkness that's encroaching because of everything that's happened, and this is Luke, kind of the way he kind of views things in a way, that you can't see what's directly in front of you, that someone came directly up to you, handed you your old lightsaber back, and asked to be trained, and you didn't. That you couldn't see within her that there were the core ideals and traits to be a Jedi, one of the best Jedi, one of the ones that really represent everything that the Jedi are in a good way. And it's one of those things where, like, the characters that you'd think of that really represent that, I suppose, in a way, are Obi-Wan, Yoda, Qui-Gon, and Luke. They're probably like the main ones that you'd have to say in terms of like they are Jedi. They are kind of the best of the best and really represent what the Jedi are. And Rey kind of has the same similar traits in a way to be that perfect Jedi in a way, and the fact that Luke couldn't see that and was so distracted by the ancient texts and the books. I thought that was very, very interesting, just that in a way Luke it got such a loss of confidence from what happened and was so negative about the Jedi Order that he looked through their entire history from this perspective of where did they fail at every single step along the way. And that's why I like, I suppose, what is it? I think it's lesson 2, where Rey kind of counters him when he says, the history of the Jedi is failure, and she says, but, yeah, sure, a Jedi trained Vader, but like, Obi-Wan didn't force Anakin over to the dark side, but who was it that got him back? It was the Jedi, it was you. And just this idea that that's the mistake that he's made, is he's focused too much on the negatives of what has happened rather than the positives. That, like, hey, the Guardians were the keepers of peace in the galaxy for so many, many years. And then, obviously, I think in a way he gives the Jedi all the credit and no credit to the villains of just like, Yeah, Palpatine really like pulled the wool over like everyone's eyes in the prequel. Like that was the culmination of this, millennia long plan from the Sith to gradually get into power and manipulate things so that he could eventually take out the Jedi Order from kind of from within. And yes, the Jedi couldn't see it, but and they made these mistakes along the way, and that's what I like about the movie, that they kind of through Luke address basically the future of the Jedi, that he is the last of the Jedi, and in a way his views on the Jedi represent where we're going to go or not going to go. So I appreciate him bringing up the past, mentioning the prequels and the mistakes that were made along the way, the mistakes he made in the new Jedi Order, and what he feels needs to be done, which is let them die. Whereas I like with Yoda that he says, what I like with the Yoda scene is that he doesn't completely dismiss really anything he talks about. In that, yes, he says, the books are a bit bland, but he says like there's wisdom in them, but they're not everything. Like that, could you not see that Rey was perfect to train? That she really represents what the Jedi is. Why couldn't you see that? So he doesn't dismiss the books, and then in a way hides the fact that Luke thinks he's burning the books, because he never actually goes in to check that they're in there. And then we later find out that Rey actually still has them. So I like that there's still that kind of hope that, maybe she won't go ahead with every single tradition of the Jedi, but that they still will persist with some of their main goals and ethos going forward. And it's a big moment, of course. He hesitates at the last minute, that he doesn't really want to do it. Yoda, destroys the tree for him, and kind of it's basically, I suppose, Yoda kind of telling Luke like, it's time to make a kind of a shift, a change, not in the same way that you think so, but to some degree we have to kind of move on and advance, and Rey is the future. I think the only problem is that there is no scene after this. It's just we basically abandon Luke for about half an hour of the movie. I don't know exactly because I don't time this stuff when I'm watching the movie, but it felt like watching the movie. We just go away from Luke for just like a half an hour, maybe more, and this is where all the stuff with Snoke, Kylo, and Rey happens, and the big fight. They get to create the big hyperspace Holdo moment happens, and then Luke comes in right at the end. I really do feel there should have been something where maybe you cut back and he's still talking to Yoda in some way, and he talks about that he's made up his mind, he knows what to do, and it's time or something like that. And you still have the kind of like gap of like you don't know exactly what he's doing, but that moment of just like, yeah, I've made my mind up, I know exactly what I need to do, and just set up the idea that he is doing something, because it is sudden when he arrives on the scene. And I suppose getting into that moment, the force projection, astral projection, whatever you want to call it, I like the scene in that it is an amazing display of force power, in the same way that the Leia scene was an amazing display of force power. But it's still it's hard to just remove the fact that all Luke did was do a distraction. That he basically killed himself to distract the First Order. And I get that that's the core of the movie. Like the rebellion is reborn, the war is only just beginning because Luke is giving them this opportunity to survive, and he's kind of passing on the future of the Jedi to Rey. It's a great moment. The line, I'll praise the line as much as possible. It's really, really well done in terms of that happening, and then the reveal that he is not really there. It's just, I think we were in a way robbed a bit of a big Luke action scene. And I'm not saying he needed to come out there, destroy like 12 80 walkers, and have a 10-minute lightsaber duel with Kylo Ren, and just display every single ability he has. But something that is just like a 1, 2, maybe 3-minute action scene with him, of him doing something. Because as the astral projection is a great technique, it's just it only serves as a distraction, and then it also afterwards you're kind of thinking like, Luke never left Octo in this entire movie. except like with the projection. And that, I think, the fact that you can say that about the movie, the fact that the action doesn't really come to Octo, he has to project his spirit away from Octo to actually be involved in everything. It's just kind of like, this is the end of Luke Skywalker. He spends the entire movie on the island that he was exiled on, and then just has one scene basically projected away from it. I definitely get from like those perspectives that, like, if you don't buy into how, like, strongly a lot of people feel about some of these big Luke scenes, I get why you could really come out of this movie not liking the way he's portrayed, not feeling that he got enough time, not feeling that the importance was necessarily placed on him all that much. I obviously lean towards liking it, so I don't have too big of an issue with it, but I still do feel that, like, there should have been something. That, like, given that we know about the astral projection technique, that he could have made himself solid, that he seems to be able to do that. The fact that the dice thing that he hands over can be picked up by different people. He specifically kisses Leia on the forehead, and he can make that projection solid. Why didn't you just use that to have some sort of a lightsaber fight? Because otherwise, this movie didn't have a lightsaber fight in it at all. You could have done that really well, because it makes the whole idea of, like, Luke, okay, he's there, but he's not really there. So he's dodging the attacks by never touching Kylo and completely staying out of his reach and range. And while it demonstrated good agility from Luke, it's just, why couldn't we have had a bit of a lightsaber duel? Why couldn't this have in some way, like, referenced the Obi-Wan Vader duel? Because that's effectively what this scene is referencing, in that here is the older master coming to confront his pupil who has fallen to darkness, and knows he's basically sacrificing himself here, but in making that sacrifice is going to kind of portray this meaning to his allies, but also show this kind of amazing power that the dark side can't do to him directly in front of him. And that's why I feel it almost would have been more impactful if Luke was present on Crate in person, and you had almost done the exact same thing that Obi-Wan did with Vader, and that is let Kylo go to give him a free shot, basically. And just as the blade hits Luke, he becomes one with the Force, and it's this moment of, he took away the rage and the anger that could have come into Kylo from killing Luke, because I suppose Kylo must know what it is to become one with the Force. Because I assume Luke probably told him, if he's done any sort of training, he probably knows the idea of what that actually is. So seeing that happen in front of him and just that being taken away from him, it would have had so much more meaning. And that's where I think I like the scene when the projection fades away, we cut back to Octo, and there he is. It's clear that this has taken everything out of him. I don't think they make it, like, overly clear that, like, this is going to kill him. There's some setup earlier on in the movie that I think Kylo says something along the lines of, like, oh, if Rey was actually the one orchestrating this connection across the galaxy between Kylo and Rey, it would probably, the exertion of that would probably kill her. So they sort of set up the idea that, like, using the Force in a really, subtle, powerful way across, star systems, more or less is using your entire life force to do it. So they sort of set it up. It's just, I don't know how much I took away from the fact that Luke kind of becomes one with the Force on his own. I love the music. I love the idea of him looking at the twin suns, and it really representing this bookmark on his, I suppose his life being like an active participant in, like, the role of the galaxy, in that the twin suns is kind of the start point of him wanting to do something, and then he's thrust into the craziness of what happens in the original movies. And then at the end of his life, he's just helped, in a way, the new rebellion move on in the same way that he did initially, and he's passing on this time. I like that. It's just, I almost think it would have had more impact if he had done it in front of everyone at Crate, because it still has the same effect. He would have been there to primarily serve as a distraction, and you would have had the moment of everyone seeing him become one with the Force. And it still creates the frustration for Kylo, who, after this movie, is going to know that Luke still passed on in some way. And it just would have actually had him present there to allow you actually to have a proper like fight scene or action scene, or really have him do something there, because you sort of set it up as well that like there is an X-wing underwater just next to Octo, suggesting basically how Luke got there. And you know, while maybe it's damaged or something like that, it's Luke. You know, there could have been a way for him to use the X-wing to get out to Crate if he needed to. So I think there's just a lot of stuff in this movie with Luke where it's just, I think there are a lot of points to debate with it. I don't think that it's just a flat out just amazing portrayal of the character. I think it's good and I still like it, but I definitely have questions with it and wouldn't be so dismissive of a lot of people who are negative about how Luke is portrayed in this movie. I think there's a reason why Mark Hamill did come out and question these same things that a lot of the fans are questioning. And as much as he's come out and said, you know, I shouldn't have voiced those things in public, you know, he still said those things. And obviously for the, you don't really want your actors involved with the movie to be involved in the criticism. But the fact that it's lining up, that the actor plus the fans, you know, are having these criticisms is valid. That they obviously had concerns about this direction and still have concerns about it. And I do to a degree as well, in that I just look at so far what we had. We had The Force Awakens, an entire movie setting up the fact that we're looking for Luke Skywalker. Luke Skywalker is missing. He's not going to be in most of this movie. Oh, here he is right at the end. Then it's 2 years waiting to see what's Luke like, what's he going to be like, how's the training with Rey going to go, what happened, blah, blah, blah. Then you jump into the movie and it's just like, oh, like half of his scenes he's just dismissing Rey. He finally jumps into training, and the training is just to kind of turn her off being a Jedi, and it eventually he pushes her away so much that she almost makes this amazing connection with Kylo. And you know, by the time Rey decides to leave to find some hope in Kylo, he has the scene with Yoda and then comes back into play. It's like, that's all you really have for Luke in this trilogy, minus some potential Force Ghost scenes in Episode 9. I get it from that perspective of just, his role is not as big in the movie as I think it maybe seemed the first time, because I think there's so much gravitas around just Luke, finally we're getting to see what he's like. But when you take that away and are just like, okay, he's a character, how much are they actually using this character? That's where I think some of the issues do come in with how they decided to utilize him. And I think there probably should have been a couple of more scenes with him to really give him that development that the arc within this movie needed, because I think there is potential with it. As I said before, I really don't have any real problem with them portraying him as a somewhat kind of broken, you know, old man who's very much struggling with, you know, his failure and his isolated himself from the galaxy. I don't really have a problem there. It's how they chose to do the scenes with him after that setup. Because I'd agree with anyone who's like making the complaints about some people expecting it to just be like older Episode 6 Luke, just like the perfect hero character, just who's isolated himself away from things. I get that, because I think that would have been a little dull to just immediately jump in and Luke just immediately welcomes her and it's just happy training days, maybe a slight little bit of conflict, and it's just Luke being Luke. You needed to have the conflict here to create the arc for him. It's just, I don't know if the arc here is as good as maybe some people think it is, in that I definitely come down somewhere more neutral between like people who absolutely hated Luke's portrayal and then the people who absolutely loved it. I'd absolutely say I lean more towards liking it, but then again, I think a lot actually depends on, in a way, where they go with Kylo. Do they go about explaining the stuff with the backstory I talked about a little bit more? Do they, in the expanded universe, cover that? Do they cover more of Luke? Now that you've basically dealt with the core of Luke's story, is he now a character who you can actually tell stories with in the expanded universe? They're the sort of questions that I want answered now that you've actually decided to do this with the character. You know, are you now going to give the fans kind of what they wanted and see what Luke is actually like in between these two movies? because that's the other side of things. I think people over time will come to accept this portrayal of Luke, but you also should probably give them something where it is more like original Luke, and that is where the expanded universe comes in to show Luke before the failure. Maybe show a little bit clearer, Luke buying into his own legend, which he talks about here. And I think that's one of those things where him saying it, that like, I was Luke Skywalker, I thought I could do everything. It's kind of like, yeah, but we know Luke, and like you're basically trying to like convince us like retroactively that like I bought into my own legend. I became arrogant after this stuff. Like this is a perfect example of show don't tell. Don't just tell us you became like arrogant and stuff like that. Show us. Like there probably maybe should have been a better flashback, but that's something the expanded universe can do. Show us Luke maybe becoming a little bit arrogant, buying into the whole idea of I'm Luke Skywalker, I'm the Jedi Master, I can do anything. But I think that's most of what I wanted to say about the movie. As I said, the Yoda scene was amazing. The R2-D2 scene actually was really good. Even just the little moment earlier on where it's like when Chewie's the one to kind of come in and properly get him to talk to Rey, and obviously Luke recognizes him. He has the where's Han moment, and that he's been obviously cut off from the Force. He doesn't know that Han has died, so there's that. And in general, I liked a lot of scenes. It's just, given that you decided to basically have Episode 8 be the in a way beginning and end of Luke Skywalker in the sequel trilogy, how they chose to use in the end, the time they spent on him, that's where I take some issue with. But in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on Luke in The Last Jedi and what I have to say about him. But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.